So, I hear you might be thinking about killing the author. It's an exciting time in any person's life when they read deciding which literary theory to apply to the way they read texts, but it's important to know what you're getting into and make sure that this literary theory is the right one for you. What is it about death of the author that appeals to you, the reader? Before you start applying literary theories, you want to make sure that you're redoing it for the right reasons. There are an awful lot of young people out there who rush into death of the author without really understanding its intended purpose. Are you trying to enhance your understanding of a text by secluding yourself from authorial intent or a body of work? Or are you trying to excuse yourself from potential guilt when you find out that your favorite author might be a shitbag, and you don't want to examine what that author does with their platform? There are a lot of people out there who advocate separating art from the artist, so they won't have to examine the ethics of consuming art from people who use their platform to do things that might be a little iffy, maybe even harmful. Before we jump in, we need to understand that applying a literary theory and examining the ethics of watching The Usual Suspects, knowing what we now know about its director and star, are two very separate issues, and it can be confusing, and you need to be careful not to conflate the two. With that in mind, let's talk about death of the author. Is death of the author right for you? Are you ready to kill the author? And is death of the author really even possible to apply to any text in our platform and personal brand-obsessed culture? Well, today we're going to talk about that, learn a little something, and maybe even have a little fun. The Fault in Our Stars is a 2012 novel written by John Green. The plot of the novel revolves around two teenagers named Hazel, Grace Lancaster, and Augustus Waters, the former living with terminal cancer, the latter in remission from his, as they begin a relationship. In the process of developing their relationship, Hazel Grace shares her favorite book of all time, An Imperial Affliction by a man named Peter Van Houten, with Augustus. Though she loves the book's ambiguous ending is a source of consternation for Hazel, and she longs for nothing more than for the notoriously reclusive Van Houten to tell her what happens after the book ends. And so Augustus, having banked his wish from the Make-A-Wish Foundation, uses that wish to make a trip to Amsterdam with Hazel and her mother to meet Van Houten. But when they finally meet Van Houten, the two find not the kind, empathetic author that they imagined, but a drunken misanthrope who refuses to answer their questions. I can no more tell you what happens to her than I can tell you what becomes of Prost's narrator, or Holden Caulfield's sister, or Huckleberry Finn after he lights out for the territories. What happens after the book ends is nothing, he insists. The book is fiction. It didn't happen. It's not real. To which a livid Hazel Grace responds, "Bullshit. That's bullshit. Just tell Mom. Make something up." Has it. To an extent, Dewey say, excused Dumbledore a little more because falling in love can blind us to an extent, but he met someone as brilliant as he was, and rather like Bellatrix. He was very drawn to this brilliant person and horribly, terribly let down by him. She added, "Ye, that's always how he saw Dumbledore." And even in 2007, that kind of intent declaration was already begging the question if representation just for representation's, especially when there is no actual reference in the text to Dumbledore's sexuality, was actually helpful, or if it was just shoehorn tokenizing for the sake of staying relevant. It is, in effect, claiming representation without having to do any of the work of including it in the text because, hey, authorial intent. And yet, after all this, despite multiple opportunities to codify Dumbledore's sexuality into the actual text, she still hasn't done it. Rowling had the opportunity to actually codify this into later texts, as she is the sole credited writer for both Fantastic Beasts movies, the latter of which touches directly on Dumbledore, angst over his relationship with Grindelwald, but no homo. Blood representation in the Harry Potterverse exists only in the paratext, in the authorial intent. Therefore, according to Bart, it does not exist at all. That said, of course authorial intent influences fan culture, and inevitably creeps into the way people read the text. People take authorial intent as word of God, and use it to shut down readings that conflict with the authorial's post-scriptural intent. And that kind of sucks. It's all well and good and valid to restrict the discourse on the Harry Potter series to the text itself, and not what the author says about the text. But here's the thing. That's neither how consuming art nor human nature works. Text is inevitably consumed with paratext, and paratext influences the way the reader interprets the text. Simply knowing the discourse around Harry Potter influences the way you read Harry Potter, whether you want it to or not. In literary theory, paratext refers to materials supplied by authors, editors, printers, and publishers. This concept has more recently expanded to anything relating to the text, ranging all the way from cultural context to personal brand to size and nature of online platform and, most importantly, to personal identity. It's not that trying to apply Barthes' idea is invalid, but that given the way culture is trending and how the focus on personal brand and identity is only increasing, even an author that tries to let their work speak for itself can never really do. Foucault was actually way more hardcore than Barthes was. Where Barthes stuck to literary theory, Foucault saw the author as a bigger problem within a wider system of thought who got in the way of the discourse. To Foucault, the author is an ideological figure that people assign meaning to the author's text just by virtue of who is saying it, rather than the meaning inherent in the text. But Foucault considered the decree that the author has disappeared to be an empty one without praxis, and stated that we must locate the space left empty by the author's disappearance, follow the distribution of gaps and breaches, and watch for openings this disappearance uncovers. In the year of our Lord 2018, we call that thing personal brand. And oh, your precious discourse has indeed been overtaken by cults of personality 50 years later. 50 years later, the work does not possess the right to kill, to be its author's murderer, because the work will always be tied to the brand, and in that brand lies a certain sort of immortality. What is brand can never be. Foucault was a big proponent not only of shedding personal identity as it pertained to works, but all the trappings of identity. We would no longer hear the questions that have been rehashed for so long. Who really spoke? Is it really he and not someone else? With what authenticity or originality? And what part of his deepest self did he express in his discourse? What difference does it make who is speaking? How one person of one gender or one race in one time and one place reads Macbeth will be read way differently than how someone else in completely different circumstances will read it. Same with who writes it. And this is a huge shortcoming of death of the author in general. It assumes that all people from all backgrounds have equal opportunity. They don't. And that all texts have equal opportunity for exposure based on the merit of the text. They don't. In a perfect world, Foucault would be right, and every would have equal opportunity, and all texts would be judged on their own merit and not tied to either the author, identity, or their body of work. But we don't live in a perfect world, Mitchell. Therefore, Foucault's ideas, and to a lesser extent Barthes, can really only exist in the world of pure theory, because who tells what story, what their background is, and why they are telling it matters to readers, and is only mattering more and more as time marches on. If you read The Fault in Our Stars, independent of any paratext, and not reading the author's note, all you know about the book is that it was written by a man. Probably. That is as pure a reading as you are going to get. But of course, this is not the reading most people had. Most people knew the paratext because the author had a platform, and a very large one. The author puts on a friendly effect for his young, largely teenage audience every Tuesday. Then you find out that the author was inspired to write the text, in part, because of an actual human person who lived and died at the age of 16. A human person who was also a YouTuber, who the author became friends with, in large part because she was his fan. This is not intent, but it is paratext, and it does influence the reading of the book. As The Fault in Our Stars blew up in popularity, so too did the backlash. Who are you, John Green, to even write this story? Does it make it more legitimate that he knew Esther Earl, or does that make it more exploitative? Is the whole enterprise exploitative? In the years that followed, as The Fault in Our Stars continued to sell incredibly well, the discourse began to focus on the author's identity, and the trend of so-called sicklit that the novel helped popularize, which is to say nothing of the content of the novel itself. People started to get upset about the fact that Hazel and Augustus share their first kiss at the Anne Frank house. And there are sex scenes in this book. What kind of a grown-ass man writes sex scenes between two teenagers? Who's that? Oh shit. The Fault in Our Stars was a 2012 novel written by me, John Green, in which I, John Green, am accidentally a character, kind of, which is what this video is about, sort of. I said I'm not interested. But you promised. Nothing happens. They re-fiction. They cease to exist the moment the novel ends. But they can't. What inspired, like, this idea that Van Houten was a reflection of you, that you were your ugliest self? Peter. Well, I think before The Fault in Our Stars was published, I was interested in the questions that I ended up writing about in The Fault in Our Stars because I'd been asked thousands of times what happened to certain characters in my book, Looking for Alaska. And I started to understand that my response to that, somewhat defensive response to that of I'm not going to tell you, oh, obviously, obviously I wanted it to be ambiguous in the story, and I still want it to be ambiguous. I started to understand that defensiveness that I had was misplaced, ultimately. And so when people ask me the same question about Hazel, or about The Fault in Our Stars, I do think of it very differently now. I feel much less defensive. I still don't feel like I have answers for them, but I understand the question. I understood that when people read books about people reading books, they inevitably put the author of the book, especially if that person is a public figure into the story. Right. Like, I remember being a kid and reading Catcher in the Rye and putting J.D. Salinger into that story. I couldn't help myself. You know that song? If a body catch a body coming through the Rye. I'd like it's if a body meet a body coming through the Rye. I felt like there was no way to write about writing without me being a character in the story in some way. Like, I was writing those parts of that book in 2010, 2011. I understood by that time that I had a public life. And in me own life, when I was a kid, I read books with the authors as characters in them. I might have even known that I should, but I couldn't help myself. But I could, I should. Like, we live in a personality-driven culture. Even then we did. A lot of people are only going to read John Green books because they have this parasocial relationship with John Green. And that's not invalid. I played into it right. Like, it's not like I tried to avoid having a public life. Like, I had an email address that they could Google. I had a YouTube channel where they could comment. Like, where did I get off saying that's an inappropriate question to ask this person who has a Twitter? That's the end of chapter 1. I wonder if there just something about Hume. Nea some feature. If you read someone who tells a fiction, you feel connected to them, whether you know anything about their lives or not. You at least feel a connection to the way that they imagine something, which is intimate in a way. And I don't know that there's any getting around that. So nerd fighters, join with Esther and me and tell someone you love that you love them today. And so the question for me is, how do authors interact with stories that they've invented in this time? I feel like the idea of death of the author kind of stemmed partially from this culture that was very absolute, and Bart kind of wanted to kill absolutes. But in return it kind of created a different absolute. I used to believe that the author should disappear insofar as possible from the text, and that the responsibility of the reader was to read the text and never think about the author. Like, I had this period in high school where I read everything in the context of the author. And then I had this long period of maybe 10 or 15 years where I tried to read nothing in the context of the author. And what I have arrived at the moment, which I'm sure I will disavow in due time, is that there is no way for an author's brand not to participate in the text if that author has a public life, or even if that author doesn't. Right. Like, J.D. Salinger famously did not have a public life, but he is all over those books. And like, when people read them, they read them in the context of J.D. Salinger. And I feel like the absolutes in reading text create this problem where you either constantly guessing the author's intent, or you reactively trying to divorce yourself from everything you know about the world around you and the author. And I just don't think that's realistic or helpful. The first amazing night of amazing I spent with Esther was at LeakyCon, a Harry Potter conference. And after all, if it weren't for Harry Potter, I would have no Esther. And also, there probably wouldn't be a Nerdfighteria. The more you know about me work, the more you know about me friendship with Esther. Oh, too much. Too much. That was a headbutt. The more you see me in that story, my hope is that the book works if you don't see me in the story. And I would honestly feel like the book failed if it needed me to be successful. But at the same time, I am definitely aware of the fact that many of the people who read it do see me in it. I mean, that's why I wrote to that author's note at the beginning was I wanted to try to protect, insofar as possible. This is a little naive in retrospect, but I wanted to try to protect the friendships that I'd had that were important to him, that had influenced the story. I wanted to keep them mine, and that proved to be impossible. And now I read that author's note, and I think, oh, that's quite sweet that that author thought that just putting a note in the beginning that says, "Don't read this autobiographically," is going to work. The Fault in Our Stars is a 2012 novel written by John Green in which two children go to great lengths to find out what happens after the ambiguous ending of the protagonist Hazel's favorite book. The way they do this is to seek out the notoriously reclusive author and find out the answer from him. But the entire idea is flawed from the get-go. Not only does her hero let her down, she does not find her answer, because there is none. And that is a central theme of the text. Sometimes there is no answer. The universe is chaotic, life is unpredictable, and you have no control of when you will die. And when you do die, you will not know what becomes of your loved ones. In seeking out the authorial intent behind a work of fiction, the two leads are trying to gain a sense of control in a chaotic universe, the sense that there is indeed an author of sorts to life, as they do not feel that they are the authors of their own stories, that they do not have control over their own fates. And indeed they do not. But in this case, letting go of that desire for a sense of control is a part of growing up, which ironically neither of these characters will get to do. They must mature into adults while never living to become adults. This is reflective not only of how we consume media and the way media can genuinely touch and inspire people, but also of a very understandable and human desire to transform that media. Narratives give us a sense of control in a world that is generally chaotic and unpredictable. We need narratives to make sense of the world that we live in. But that does not mean that we have control over the narrative. The character arcs of both Hazel and Augustus are defined by letting go of that desire for control of their own narratives and accepting that life, short though it is, just doesn't work that way, no matter how much they wish it did. But that's just me reading. That's just read. Listen, Lindsay, what would it look like if we all listened more? I don't know, John. What would it look like? It would look like a better world, Lindsay. And listening to audiobooks motivates us. It inspires us, and it can even bring us closer together. There is no better place to listen than Audible, because now Audible members get even more exclusive audio fitness programs, audiobooks, Audible Originals, and more. Audible has the largest selection of audiobooks on the planet, and now with Audible Originals, the selection has gotten even more custom, with content made for members. Host, pick a book to discuss that resonates with your audience. I recommend Turtles All the Way Down by Me. It's read by Kate Rudd. She's so good at that job. Or this one. Oh, this was. This one. Also narrated by Kate Rudd. She did a great job. She did such a good job that they hired her to do this one too. You should just get both of them. It's only 2 Audible credits. Yeah, one of them's free. Go to audible.com/Lindsay Ellis. You can do it with audiobooks. Start a 30-day trial, and your first audiobook is free. You can go to audible.com/Lindsay Ellis. That's audible.com/Lindsay Ellis to get your first audiobook free. Or text Lindsay Ellis to 500 minus 500. That's Lindsay with an A, Ellis with Annie and I, Toolton and Anns, to 500 minus 500 and get your first audiobook free and make it turtles all the way down. That way Lindsay and when. The Fault in Our Stars was a 2012 novel written by Lindsay Ellis. I did it. She did a good job. Yay. She doesn't get any of the royalties. I get the credit. Apparently. Yeah, but the money is mine.